Welcome to the latest episode of Corner Your Market podcast. Today, I have Amelia Coomber here with me, and she is a measurement guru. She works for Podscribe, which is a podcast measurement and analytics platform. It's a startup. She's based out of LA, but I think the company's based out of Texas, somewhere probably in Austin, like all these great startups are. But Amelia is the head of growth and marketing, I believe. I don't believe, I know that for sure. She's the head of growth and marketing. She's done a lot of work in marketing in terms of her background has a lot of analytics and a lot of numbers behind it. She actually comes from a software background and has transitioned into marketing. Kind of one of the reasons why I connected with her really well is because I have a similar background. I come from a physics and math background, and I came into marketing, and she comes from a software background, and she came into marketing. And so we have a kindred spirit in that regard. So welcome to the latest episode of Corner Your Market. I'm your host, Silas Kimide. In this podcast, I talk about all things digital marketing, from website design and development to SEO and PPC, as well as paid advertising, email marketing, social media, and anything in between. If you're a small business owner, a marketing manager in a company, or an entrepreneur, this podcast is for you. So tune in every Thursday at 10 a.m. You'll gain some practical insights, new strategies, tactics, and tools that will help you grow your business. To subscribe, go to corneryourmarketpodcast.com and select the podcast app of your choice. Then you can hit subscribe within those apps. That again is corneryourmarketpodcast.com. Also, don't forget to like and share our individual episodes. You can also leave a review in the app once you've listened to one of our episodes. So welcome to the podcast, Amelia. I'm glad you're able to make some time for this.
Thank you so much for having me. No, excited to be on. And gotta love a STEM major.
Yeah, I know. Isn't that amazing? I mean, I feel like if you're not going to do STEM, why go to college, right? Do you? Why go to college, right? Because does anybody really contribute other than the STEM people in the world? So anyway, I wanted to talk a little bit. I know we had a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and you talked about your podcast measurements. This is a podcast. There's a lot of podcasts out there. I follow Neil Patel, a wonderful SEO guru, which if you're not following him, I would highly recommend you follow him. A couple of months ago, he made this tweet about how a lot of brands have blogs, a lot of brands have websites, a lot of brands have channels and social media, but not a lot of brands have podcasts. So can you talk a little bit more about your work and how it relates to podcast and how it relates to measurement and how it relates to business?
Yeah,
I know that's a lot to cover, but we have some time. So
great. So yeah, like you said, Podscribe is really we do pixel-based attribution for podcast advertising. So whether you're a publisher or a network that is running a podcast, is producing a podcast and selling ads, or if you're an advertiser or an agency buying podcast ads, we basically work with them to, again, just better measure in real time, similar to your traditional digital channels, what that actual performance and measurement looks like. So things like, how many visitors were driven to your site? How many actual pixel-based conversions did you get? Stuff like that. We can go into how all of that works. It's very technical because it is a semi-offline channel, so a little different from the Facebooks and the Googles and things like that. But we've come a long way in terms of the measurement capabilities for podcasting and podcast advertising. Historically, everything's been about promo codes and vanity URLs, which, as you can assume, if anybody's listening to this, try to remember a podcast promo code, you can't, right? So
you're listening to the show. I've always thought that was kind of weird. You're listening to the show and then all of a sudden this ad comes on and says, use this promo code. I'm at the gym, dude. I'm on a treadmill right now. I'm not going to write that down.
No. And it's only about 30% of people who actually were exposed to the podcast ad and then were, converted, actually use that podcast promo code. So you're leaving so many conversions just completely unattributed, or we're being attributed to other channels. One of the most common paths is you hear a brand on a podcast, you're like, okay, that's interesting. And then you go and Google it, right? Like the first thing you're going to see is a Google ad. And then you click on that and then Google says, hey, we drove that conversion. So really trying to level up podcast advertising and then the measurement in general to make it a competitive channel like, the other digital ones because it really is. It can unlock incremental audiences. It's a sort of unique form of influencer marketing. If you like Neil Patel and Neil Patel tells you about a software, he's like your friend, right? You're going to listen to him. Whereas, if you're just scrolling on Facebook and you see that same software as an ad, you're like, okay, whatever. So it has so much opportunity. And I think a big, reason, not only for me working as, director of acquisition at a lot of different, CPG and e-com brands, but I was always hesitant to get into it because I couldn't measure it like a typical digital channel. And so we're really at the forefront of, again, sort of leveling up podcast advertising and making it, be competitive with all the other channels.
And so I'm a little new to this, so I might ask some very dumb questions here, but how does your pixel tracking differ from what maybe some of these podcast hosts give you? Like how different is that?
From what do you mean what the podcast hosts give you?
Like when you're hosting your podcast, like this podcast I host and hosting, right? They give me downloads, they give me all that kind of stuff. But I guess you're talking about the ads that you actually run on the ad.
Exactly. So if you run an ad, for instance, you probably use Megaphone.
I'm not big enough to run ads yet.
Okay. But either way, the hosting platform, all the hosting platforms or a majority of the hosting platforms are going to have ways in which you can insert those ads. And so when you eventually do run ads or for any other show that's running ads, there is a place to basically add third-party tracking. And so it's, podcasting is different again, because like you said, you get the downloads, right? That's at the end of the day, an impression, a listen is a download because podcasting is an offline channel. So what really happens in like 15 seconds when it comes to how podcasts are consumed is that when you click play on your episode in Spotify or Apple, rather than that episode actually being streaming like live, it's actually that audio file is being downloaded locally to your device. So I always explain it. Podcasting is more similar to like a Word doc than like a Google Doc, where
okay. Yeah. So it's like, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so if you make a comment in the doc that I shared or you change something, that change is not going to be reflected on mine. Whereas in Google Docs, that would be reflected, or I can see you listening to it. So because that audio file is locally downloaded to that device, again, the only thing that we get is like the download, the time of download, and the information about like what was in the episode. And so podcasting is a lot more like linear or CTV in that sense. And so again, it makes attribution a little more difficult, because when you're on Facebook, Facebook knows how many seconds you watched through the ad. If you skipped it, what other content you were engaging with. So, but podcasting was invented, RSS feed, which is what podcasts are hosted on, is called really simple syndication. And it's basically, sort of like a decentralized way where no one platform owns it to, basically distribute this content. So,
because I hear a lot of, but one of the main hesitations for even myself podcasting and a lot of people podcasting is they don't know beyond the downloads and they don't know is the end user actually, it's kind of like radio advertising, right? Is the end user actually responding to that advertisement? How do you guys, how do you track that? I mean, from the ads?
Yeah. So Apple Podcasts for like, if you host your podcast on Apple or you distribute it on Apple, they have something called Apple Connect. And and I think Spotify is something similar. It's probably the closest thing to actually getting engagement metrics alongside your podcast. So you can determine and see how many people, what percentage of the content they listen through, things like that. On the like measurement side, again, we don't get that information. So all we get is the IP address. We get the time of download. We know what advertisers were in the podcast episode and things like that. And so again, that's why the attribution for podcast advertising is a little closer to like a view through methodology rather than like a direct click through methodology, because there is nothing to click, right? So what we basically do is we grab the IP of the download and then we have a pixel on that advertiser's website, just like Facebook. It's the same sort of thing. We've got a Shopify app, takes 2 seconds, but we basically match the IP that was exposed to the ad and then the IP that purchased, and we match them together. Yes, there are instances, it doesn't happen very often, but where somebody downloads an episode, maybe they only listen 50% of the way through, and they didn't even get exposed to the ad. Again, most likely that IP is not going to match to a purchase because they weren't exposed to the ad. And we've got a lot of other ways in which you can sort of narrow down those attribution settings, exclude other channels from what's getting credit and things like that. So it's definitely not perfect. I always say like pixel progress, not perfection. But it's so much better and further along than, again, just using a promo code or a vanity URL.
It seems like podcast advertising is so easy to skip though, right? I mean,
kind of. Yeah.
I mean, you can pretty much, I'm guilty of it. I'll be listening to my true crimes podcast and then the ad comes on and I'm like, skip 30. I hit about 5 times and 2.5 minutes of ads are all skipped over.
Yeah. I mean, but scrolling on Facebook or Instagram or TikTok and swiping up through an ad is just as easy. So I totally agree. I think, again, that the things that podcasting, what really separates it in terms of the medium compared to other channels is that when it's done right, and again, we're not talking like AT&T's pre-produced, ads that just come on and are very jarring and, sort of break up the listening experience. But you've probably listened to ads, and I can name a couple, like the Andrew Huberman and even my favorite true crime podcast, which is Morbid. When the hosts do a really good job of integrating that ad into the content, sometimes you don't even know you're listening to an ad. And obviously make sure you disclose that, but you don't have to be like, hey, this ad is brought to you, or this show is brought to you by whatever. I've listened to ads where they take similar approaches to like TikTok and other Facebook, where they have a hook, right? So that first 3 seconds is going to like catch the user's or the listener's attention, draw them in, and then they sort of sell them on the product. And again, I've listened to a lot of ads where, it wasn't until 10 seconds through that I, figured out it was an ad. So absolutely. There's also some interesting stuff because, Google and YouTube ads, for instance, right? Sometimes you can't skip them until you listen to like 3 seconds. There's some interesting studies where you actually have a higher likelihood when you're not allowed to skip the ad that you do skip the second you do. Whereas if, again, there's nothing blocking you from skipping a podcast ad, you can hit that 15 seconds. Some people don't. They're afraid they're going to miss the content. And again, it gives them the flexibility. They're not being told they have to listen. And so they end up just sort of listening through. So absolutely. And there's a lot of technicalities there. But when it's done right, especially on the ad side of things, it can be a very, very compelling medium. But you can't just, throw spaghetti at the wall and expect your podcast ads to perform.
I find Lex Friedman. Do you listen to Lex Friedman?
Yes,
love him. He has an interesting strategy too at the beginning where he just says, the only reason I'm able to provide this show uninterrupted is through these ads. So I'd really appreciate it. The first couple of times I skipped over, but then after the third or fourth, I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna listen to these just because he asked me and I like his content and I want to support him. So I listened to it. I was like, okay. It was long. It was like 4 or 5 minutes of advertising.
I know, and his are kind of dry.
Very dry. He just reads a piece of paper.
I know. But I totally agree. And when podcasts like hosts, they do that because, again, you listen to him because you respect him. And, the Morbid girls, like I consider them like my friends, right? So when they come on and they're like, listen, you get this for free because of these wonderful sponsors. I'm like, there's almost like an element of shame in me being like, I'm a cheapo if I skip it, So it's just a little bit more of an incentive for me to continue listening.
It's like not tipping, right?
Seconds. Yeah.
It's like not tipping, right? We don't not tip because, so same thing. So, so in terms of what kind of, like if you're an advertiser looking to use podcasts and you're wanting to do advertisement on podcasts, what metrics should you be looking at then from an advertiser perspective that would say this has been a successful campaign?
For sure. I mean, it's all the same stuff as digital channels, right? Like you have your top line goals. So like, are you, is success via a certain CAC, customer acquisition cost? You want to acquire a customer at a certain cost. Is it ROAS? You want a certain, a return on ad spend. So maybe you're looking for a 1X or a 2X, which basically, is for every dollar I spend on advertising, how many dollars in revenue am I going to get back? All of those things I think are the sort of like, bottom funnel metrics. And, with a pixel-based attribution provider, you are able to see those things in real time. The other things, again, that pixel-based attribution in particular brings, because even with promo codes, you could sort of extrapolate a CAC or, divide your spend by the number of promo codes and whatever that revenue is. Again, you're missing a huge portion of the people that were exposed and converted. But the thing that promo codes and vanity URLs don't give you is like, how many visitors were driven to our site? What was that visitor to impression rate? What was that visitor to conversion rate? So with pixel-based attribution, again, we're actually using pixels and IP matching to determine who was exposed to the ad and who visited and then who purchased. And so you get those sort of like more mid-funnel metrics, which are really important, especially, from a performance marketer standpoint or a media buyer. You would never just like throw money at Facebook and then look at the conversions. You're pushing your Facebook ads live. 2 days later, you're looking at, all right, what is that click-through rate? What is that view-through rate, right? So pixel-based attribution allows you to see all those things so that you can optimize in real time rather than waiting for just the promo codes and running your ad for a month and being like, all right, at the end of the day, was it a success or, a failure? It allows you to do that optimization, get insights of how the campaign is performing very early on. That, again, you just can't get with what I call those indirect methods of attribution.
Yeah. So in terms of the platform itself, if I were to buy advertising and I was to get it on like a particular show, is that ad embedded? You compared it with the Google. Is it embedded into the podcast episode? Like if I were to go back and listen to that episode 5 years later, I would still hear that same ad, or is it dynamic, meaning it's a piece of code and then every time somebody listens to it, the ad is different? I've never re-listened to a podcast and kept track of it to know.
Great
I'm curious.
Questions. So there's two types of podcast ads. One is baked in, or what we would call like episodic. And for those ads, theoretically, yes, you can listen to an old news podcast, for instance, 2 years ago. And if there was an advertiser running a baked in or an episodic ad, yes, all that ad would still live in there. And they're sort of like live ad reads is what they're called. Those are becoming less popular because, like, again, promo codes might change, seasonality might change, things like that. The other type is called DAI, which is dynamic ad insertion. And those are whether it's for specific episodes, specific targeting, let's say we're both listening to the same podcast, but they want to target me instead of you, women between the ages of whatever, they can do that. So the ad will only be delivered to a subset of the listeners. And those are also sort of referred to as like impression based, where you're buying on impressions rather than buying on specific episodes. So both of those are great. A lot of the baked in episodic ads are now actually becoming DAI, because again, what's the point of me having an ad that lives in a podcast 3 years ago? YouTube's a little different now that, there's a lot of podcasts being consumed on YouTube.
Yeah. Tell me about that. How is YouTube different?
So those are called, every, podcast should have a YouTube presence, right? Like it's as easy as putting up a camera and then posting it on YouTube. So YouTube, there's no like hosting. YouTube is the hosting platform, right? You upload the video and then it lives. You can't upload multiple versions of a video, right? And, it's different than like running YouTube ads, for instance. So, when you buy, and those are like, when you're buying podcasts and YouTube, it's called simulcast. You're, buying simulcast, or simulcast streaming or whatever the word would be. But those like ads are going to live in that YouTube video forever, unless the publisher or the, sort of YouTube owner like re-uploads a different video, which even I'm not even sure if that's possible, because I think you would probably lose the views associated with it. So podcasts, they can be inserted dynamically in terms of the ads, but YouTube, if you're doing like an actual, you and I were to jump on and all of a sudden talk about some sort of brand and we posted this on YouTube, that is going to live in there forever.
Right. So if you're a small business, like a lot of the people that listen to the show are small business owners. They might have a dental practice. They might have a veterinary clinic. They might be a small manufacturer. What would you tell them in terms of podcast advertising? Do you have a sense for what kind of budgets they should have? They probably need to create an audio file, right? Audio ad. They have to go record it somewhere. Do you know what I mean? Or just or work with the show's production, or do you work with like a media buyer, or how would you approach that?
Yeah. So there's a lot of different ways you can get started. I would say, so there's two types of ad delivery types, right? We said episodic baked in, and then impression based or DAI, which is more of the targeting. There's also two types of ad read types. So one is pre-produced, where to your point, like maybe the brand has somebody on their team record an audio snippet, and then that's what's going to get inserted. The other type is called host read. And it's basically where, again, if you have this podcast and you're promoting a software, the brand actually gives you the set of talking points, and then you do that ad read. Typically, host-read, as you would imagine, are going to perform way better than pre-produced, right? It's native to the content. It's you're the, it's like Neil Patel telling you about this thing. You're going to resonate with him and what he has to say more than if like some random person came on and again, sort of broke up that listening experience. So I wouldn't say that you need to focus on, again, recording that audio script. I would say that especially for getting started, you're going to see a lot more bang for your buck when you have the host actually deliver that ad and let them go through their storytelling, why they're interested in this product, how it helped them, things like that. Again, approach it like influencer marketing. So if you're a smaller brand, again, podcasting, it's a little harder to get into. You can't just set up a Facebook ad account, install your pixel and push go. It's one of those original channels where a lot of it is about like relationships. And so knowing the shows, knowing the publishers, things like that. There's a lot of other companies out there. Acast is one of them, things like that, where they offer self-service models for getting started in podcast ads. And again, even doing host-read ads where, you're looking at 25 to 50K. Sometimes you can do smaller if there's, do other sort of like different strategies around where you're going to be delivering these ads to. But you can sort of jump in the platform similar to a Facebook ads, give them all your criteria, set your budget, tell them where you want those ads to be delivered, and you can click go. And even with Acast, they actually are a big partner of ours. And so you get free attribution too. So you get all of those things. So I think, it's about understanding that it's closer to influencer marketing than it is like, again, Facebook or digital, making sure you have the right tracking capability set up in place. And maybe that's not using pixel-based attribution from the get-go. And maybe that is just making sure you can do promo codes. You can, have vanity URLs or UTMs, things like that. Being patient. Again, it can unlock unique audiences that you can't hit on Google, whether it's non-brand or brand or Facebook, and not only not hit them, but can't resonate with them necessarily in the same way you can. Again, get that awareness, really being, deliver it to people that, have something that they want to listen to because they love the content of the episode.
So if you're a small business and you're thinking, okay, I know this show, I've been listening to this show. I'd like to advertise on there. I just approach them, work out the deal, and then we would use PodScribe on the back end for actually doing the tracking. Is that how it works?
Mm-hmm. Okay. You could, yeah. Again, if you wanted to use pixel-based attribution, which again would give you the visits and all of those sorts of things. But also, I'm not here to sell PodScribe. Podcast advertising in general, again, can really, really drive, those, net new users and things like that. And so even promo codes and vanity URLs, they can still work. And so if you, didn't want to pay for something like PodScribe, or you were just trying to figure out the validity of podcast advertising, you could still try, lower effort methods like promo codes. And just make sure you have some form of tracking set up. And again, even, something I didn't mention, which is post-purchase surveys. So when that person signs up for a lead, how did you hear about us on a podcast? Right. Things like that. Those can all still be indicators that you're driving visits to your site. You just might not get full transparency into everybody. Use a PodScribe, use those sort of indirect methods. But again, podcast advertising, it's a huge channel. And sort of Neil Patel said, there's not a lot of brands flocking to it. So it's sort of one of those last frontiers in terms of being able to, not pay a huge amount and sort of reach those incremental people.
It's a tough effort though. I've been podcasting. This is episode number 83.
Wow.
So I've been podcasting for a while now, maybe a year and a half, 2 years. And I didn't start with video, which I kicked myself. I should have started with video right away. Video changed the YouTube's shorts. Changed my reach. I mean, it's like I put something up and I get few hundred views right away. It's like, wow, this is amazing, man. Who are these 200 people? I want to find them and ask them why they listen to me. But anyway, but it's still there's still effort in podcasting. I think Neil Patel had a really good article. It resonated with me partly because I'm doing what he's saying to do. So it's always like a validation, from somebody that is such an authority. But to put together a podcast with the content, guests, relevant information, and making it really useful, it takes effort. It takes effort.
Absolutely.
Which I know you're not saying it doesn't take effort. What I'm saying, it takes effort, but it's not insurmountable. I noticed that after the first 3 or 4 months, I got used to it. I knew what everything was. I'm such a process guy. I even opened up Google Sheets and I wrote down my process. So all I have to do is open that document and I know what I'm got to do. Then I don't sit here going, oh shoot, I forgot this. You know what I mean?
Yep.
That's the worst part. So
no, absolutely. And I
yeah.
love that. And we didn't even talk about like actually having a podcast for your own company, but the huge opportunity there. I mean, again, even some of the things we're talking about, you couldn't recreate or get me to say in the form of like, let's collaborate on an article and stuff like that. And so, I've seen so many companies, both B2B and B2C, that, use podcasts to interview great people, provide valuable content. And then again, now they know about you and they know about your brand. And so I think it probably is a little easier than writing a bunch of blogs or, things like that. Again, it's talking, you're hearing people, you're getting unique perspectives. So I totally agree. And I think it's a great strategy.
I've always been a talker. I've always been more of a talker than a writer. So I've always thought podcasting is so much easier than writing a blog post or an article, which, I mean, it's not, that's also good too. But what are some, we're coming towards the end here, but what are some podcasts you listen to? You mentioned Morbid. Any business related podcasts that you would recommend that for our audience?
Yeah, I listen to it's called the Marketing Spark podcast, and I'm not an avid listener, but they have got some really great guests there, and I've listened to a couple. One of my favorite episodes was like how CMOs have to communicate effectively with CEOs, and I thought that was just like really valuable. There's another one called like the Marketing Playbook or something like that. They have like a little Inspector Gadget guy, and I love that. There's some other really great lead gen podcasts that I love. Obviously, there's your classic, like how you built this or how I built this. The Chew on This podcast, if you're a D2C brand or in the sort of performance marketing space, and even Limited Supply is another really great one. So I also love the, health and wellness ones. Andrew Huberman is one of my favorites. So there's just so much good content out there.
There's a lot of, I feel like podcast has changed my life. I mean, not me podcasting, but listening to podcasts over the last few years. I mean, I have found so many podcasts. People put such good quality out there. And I have become a different person in the last 5 years because I've been listening to podcasts.
I could not agree more. And even in the sense, one of the biggest things for me is like, I feel like when I listen, to people talk and how they think about things, like whether you're consciously or unconsciously, you're picking up those things. And so I found that I've become more articulate after listening to really great people. It's changed my perspective on ideas. It's, rounded out those perspectives. So I'm a big fan of just like listening to people talk and hearing the way they think about things. And again, there's no other better way to do that than, kind of an unscripted, conversation between two like-minded people.
Awesome. That's awesome. Well, Amelia, I want to thank you, but before we jump off, if people want to connect with you, how do they connect with you? I know your LinkedIn is one great way to connect with you, right? I'll drop that in the show notes.
Yeah.
Show notes.
I'm pretty on top of LinkedIn, so if you message me, I'll definitely take a look at it. Yeah.
And then podscribe.com is the company you're working for right now. So that's where you're the head of marketing. So definitely visit there and learn more about how you can measure your podcast advertising and things like that. So, well, thank you so much, Amelia, for taking the time to be on this podcast. I personally learned a lot, and I'm sure my guests learned a lot. My listeners learned a lot as well. We covered, podcast measurement and everything associated with that. So, thank you very much for your time, Amelia, and we'll be seeing you around on LinkedIn, I guess.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. This was awesome.
If you're a small business owner, a marketer in a company, or an entrepreneur, this podcast is for you. You'll become better educated and informed when it comes to digital marketing. And if you implement the strategies, tactics, and tools I discuss in this podcast, your business will grow and prosper. To subscribe, go to corneryourmarketpodcast.com. That again is corneryourmarketpodcast.com. You can also search for Corner Your Market in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcast, and you can subscribe through those apps. Also, don't forget to like and share our individual episodes. You can also leave a review. Finally, I would love to hear from you, so if you have any questions, feedback, or general comments about the topics I discussed, feel free to send me an email. I will be sure to share and discuss your feedback on the air if it will benefit our listening audience. You can write to me at connect@corneryourmarketpodcast.com. Just put listener comment in the subject line. That email again is connect@corneryourmarketpodcast.com. Thanks for listening. I look forward to being back next week. Until then, be good and do good.